Welcome to the Code Review Weekly Workshop. I had the first item on the agenda, and I'll share my screen so we're just all looking at the same thing. And I wanted to share something that was like, this is like my favorite way that these threads play out. And so here was an MR, which was a community contribution. And I had made a suggestion, and Yannick, you're familiar with this. We worked on this together. We were like, hey, we really need to add some test coverage here. So I suggested a patch of, hey, let's add this feature spec. Since we're adding a feature spec, we probably need to get this reviewed. And Peter left an awesome non-blocking question of, we do this a lot. Maybe we should have a helper to do it. And he created the issue. And earlier, I know we've alluded to the humongous backlog of issues, but look at how well scoped this issue is. There's a clear problem statement, the solution, a link to the discussion, and it was findable as I don't know if it had. It looks like it doesn't have a weight, but like I know even if you add a weight to it and other labels to it, sure enough, pretty shortly after it was opened, the community contributor wanted to work on it, and they picked it up, asked a question about just the approach, and I got to respond with, here's just the approach. But I was surprised then it was just like a couple of days later, this issue's closed because community contributor created the MR, got, activity on it, and it got merged. So I wanted to just encourage anybody listening that leaving non-blocking follow-up stuff, the best outcome, and it happens, and it's great when it does, is community contributors can pick them up. And if we make the issues attractive to community contributors, that's nothing but good for the GitLab wider community and our code base, keeping things clean. This was awesome. So thanks, Peter, for leaving this non-blocking comment. It's easy to feel like, hey, we shouldn't leave non-blocking comments, but in an open source project. And I was also thinking about the mech stuff, that it's probably really in line with our values and really helps us in the long run if we're just very transparent of all the comments that we have. So yeah, this was a good example.
Do you think it's better when you think as a reviewer, oh, this could be done in a follow-up? Is it better to just create the follow-up issue or to like let the author do it? Because I'm really not, I'm always not sure.
Good question. That's a really good question. I think it depends on where I'm at. Like if I have time, I don't mind creating it. It shouldn't take me more than 5-ish minutes to create it. The hardest part is, like, for me, the hardest part is finding these labels to apply to it. So usually without thinking about it, I'll just apply whatever was on the MR, that's whatever it is. So
yeah, I like creating them, but sometimes I feel like, well, I have created them before. Sometimes I leave it up to the author. Sometimes I feel like maybe they don't get created if I leave it up to the author all the time, because it is non-blocking. So there's no action really implied there.
yeah.
Peter did was really helpful because that issue would not probably have been picked up by anyone. Yeah. Unless it had the two proposal and the problem kind of detailed at the top.
I would say that by default, if you're leaving a non-blocking comment that you think would be helpful to be picked up, actually, creating the follow-up issue yourself is probably the best thing to do by default. But if there is some really special information that's needed to actually create the issue, that's probably when I wouldn't want to waste my time.
Yeah, well, what I've done in the past, if I don't have time to write up like a more details above it, I'll just assign it to myself and then come back later and write up a little bit more details about the issue, about what the fix is. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. I still have some issues that are assigned to myself.
I have like 80 plus issues assigned to myself. I'm not getting down that backlog at all.
No, well, some of them, most of the time I will go back. Some of the follow-up issues that were created, the problem is so complicated. The write-up is not, it's not like a simple, it wasn't, it's, it was more like this code is bad and needs to be completely refactored. Like
Yeah.
versus, we could do like a helper method. That's great. That's easy.
Yeah. We do have a handful of tools, and it sounded like Chad and Yannick, you guys wanted to hop in on something. So what were you guys, what were you all thinking? Or
I highly do agree with what I've just heard. One thing that I could add is I also make a distinction about how generic a follow-up would be. And what I mean by that is the one that we're currently looking at from Peter, this is like purely about a code base. This is about a helper function to introduce. So that would be something I'd be perfectly fine to, as a reviewer, create the follow-up myself. Where this kind of shifts, it's when this is very, very close to the product we'll be looking at. Like, for example, in security is like this one thing in the vulnerability tab, and we just have to add another tab or whatever it might be. That is kind of where I usually shy away from and ask the author to do it. That's usually how I proceed with this.
yeah. What do you think, Chad?
So I had this happen recently too. It was probably almost 2 years ago when I was working on the CAPTCHA stuff, and I noticed that a couple of the services, there was a good like dozen lines that was duplicated between them. They're almost identical. And I was like, this is probably should be cleaned up, pulled out. If there's a couple lines, it wouldn't be that bad, but a dozen was worth creating an issue. And then a couple of weeks ago, somebody came along and picked it up. But what they did was they were sort of in and I saw it coincidentally an article right after this. They were in the peak of drought page, peak of drought phase of their software development journey. And they like dried up everything. They like pulled every single duplicated thing up to the parent class. And then they did some other questionable things like putting things in class variables, which is a really bad idea in Rails because you leak state between requests. And so I spent it was between half an hour and an hour, spending a lot of time like helping educate them. I'm like, this is really good. But I talked about coupling and cohesion and solid and how sometimes it's okay to just hold your nose about the duplication and that abstraction, inheritance versus that. And yes, we have to use inheritance in Rails, but we have multiple inheritance and we can use modules like I did over here. Here's a great example. Yeah. And maybe you just take this one little part and try to do it as a concern and a mix in with the Rails way. And then I coincidentally saw that article about the peak of drought and sent it to them. And so this giant comment. I was like, man, are they going to be upset? Are they going to think I'm giving them a hard time or discouraging? And they're like, no, this is great. I learned so much. You're right. I'm probably in the peak of drought. That was a great article.
Oh, cool.
But I want to do something on this. I'll get back to it. But that was like 2 weeks ago and they haven't. We'll see if they do.
Yeah. And I think with some of these follow-ups, and if the intent is the target audience for this issue is the community, the wider community, you have to add to your like profitability bottom line of like, am I doing this the most profitable way? You got to add to it training the community. And
I love talking about but there's also like, well, there's an hour out of my day.
Yeah. But it's good. I think it's profitable. It's good. And you know what? I appreciate you sharing that because it's so easy for us to be like, oh man, someone's going to be apprehensive to us disagreeing with something they spent a lot of time on. But I think the wider community generally feels like they're honored guests in our code base. And I think they're very receptive to feedback. I think I have had maybe definitely less than 10%. It feels like 5% or less actual pushback on suggestions from community contributors. Usually it's just super smooth and they're really grateful for me taking the time, and it's educating experience for everybody. I appreciate you sharing that story. I think that's a good story. Like, I can't get into, I think we're getting better at our automated processes for seeing if what happens when community contributions go stale. So be curious to see what happens there. But yeah, 2 weeks in community contribution time, that's just a couple of days, really,
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, even if they never come back and finish it, it's like the act of having to explain in detail, like, this is why you don't do this. These are the software development, fundamentals and philosophy behind this. This is how you should do it a different way. Like, that makes me a better programmer to have to articulate that in an extremely clear way to someone who may be less experienced, because that's the only mark of a true expert, is if you can explain something complicated to somebody who doesn't understand it. And that's really good practice. It's extremely time consuming, but it's fun and it's good practice. It makes you better.
Yeah, I think it's a good litmus test of, like, if we're the longevity of the code base, I think is going to be dependent on the culture and not just hyper focus on the code base. And so that's cool. Thanks for sharing that story, Chad. That was cool. Yeah, thanks for letting me share this example. So I thought that was interesting and helpful. Any other show and tell or questions before we hop into are we using MariaDB or MySQL? What kind of databases are we using? I'm joking.
SQLite all the way.
SQLite? Oh yeah.
Let me think if there's anything that's come up recently for me. I'm trying to think of like reviews. No, I mean, I guess I'm always just struggling with like reviewing things that I don't feel comfortable 100% in, or something that I don't do on my everyday, but that fits right into database reviews. I don't write database migrations, hardly ever. I've done very few here.
Yeah.
So
Well,
at least by reviewing them, I feel like I'm keeping my skill set up to like what is required, what has changed. I don't know if I'll ever be comfortable reading those explain plans, even though I've gone through the training multiple times. I'm still like, oh God. At least I feel like I've gotten better at it. Before it just looked like some magical thing that I'm like, okay, I don't know what that is. But yeah.
I'm pretty
sure
sure
the same way. Like, I don't think I've written a single migration in my 3 years here. Like, I'm always off in some weird corner of the app, or not even the main app. That's not even Rails. It's like not even.
You're off the rails, man. You're off the rails.
I'm off the rails.
No, I'd love to check that out. Yeah. I'm pretty sure, what is it? Is it full outer join? That's the fastest one, right? I'm joking. I just know that that's not the fastest.
I'm telling you, I'll have to go look that picture up like every time I have to figure out what the joins are.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I need the little Venn diagram that's like what ones means what, because I don't know.
Do you want to share your screen, Terry, if you want to?
Okay, let me see.
Well, I can do it. Then just navigate.
I can.
Because I don't know what I need to be looking at. So I'm already ready. So
I'll put some links in here because I already shared the MR.
Okay.
I did not review this for database. I think I did the maintainer for like, I don't know, like the backend is really the database as well. It's like there's not like some line that delineates it where it's like, nah, you don't look at that.
Yeah, that's
so true. I feel like it's kind of nice because that means if you do database MR, you probably have like 4 sets of like a set of 4 people looking at it.
Yeah.
And being full stack, like, it's hard for me to not look at the front end code, like when I'm called for a back end review too.
I think this is touching on, so like database, I think just bringing that up, you bring up a good point of like, this can automatically, some reviewers are like, this is outside my expertise. I don't need to look at this. I don't want to look at this. But I think you bring up a really good point of like, no, this is software and everything's connected. Yeah, you could spend all the time reviewing just the back end, but if there's actually something fundamentally wrong with the data, at the back of what is going on. If I'm a front end reviewer, I'm not worried about the details of the back. I'm not looking for like the human linting that we kind of.
Yeah, I would say like it's hard for me to look at the front end code. I have done Vue, but again, as soon as I'm done with it, I feel like it just is like gets mashed into like the far corner of my brain and never accessed again.
And you bring up a really good point, and I would almost say, and correct me, let me know what you think, Yannick and Chad. I would almost say that front end review has more of a requirement to be aware of what the backend is going on because of its position in the stack. It should be aware of that where it's consuming it. But it makes sense that backend would be concerned about database, but like the concern of backend to front end, I might be concerned of how it's consuming. Maybe there's some things I can make easier on the front end, maybe, but
yeah. I have asked front end engineers before, like, can you let me know there's a new thing I'm exposing? Like, does this does the way the data is presented make sense?
yeah.
Are you having to go and do too much work to get everything the way you need? Like, I mean, especially when you're making something new.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's an excellent point. I do agree with what Paul just said, that front end, the front end code kind of executes at the very last, so we're kind of the very latest in the chain. What you just meant, Terry, is sometimes I wish that, especially on products that maybe switch teams or are in teams where people switch a lot or whatever it might be, that we would have some proper documentation about the APIs we are using between the front end and the back end. And by that, I don't mean a HAML file or whatsoever. So maybe something that we like, okay, this is the interface we're connecting with. This was added at this date for that reason whatsoever. Because sometimes stuff is missing. Sometimes front end is just jumping through all the firings, or things get passed which are actually not needed or even dangerous. So that is something that I feel like we can improve on.
Are you talking about like distinguishing between if I'm writing HAML and I want to get a thing? It could be really confusing. What's the single source of truth for this thing? It could be like, is there a presenter for this? I don't know. What is a presenter? I see model used everywhere. Controller has variables. I use these controller variables. Like, yeah, that can be a challenge for sure. And I think we can run into issues when we don't use the single source of truth, because we can end up circumventing permission checks because we just directly access the model instead of going through something that actually. That architecture is challenging from a front ender perspective of what the back end does. And what were you thinking?
I guess that really proves what both of you said. I mean, you kind of, and sorry, front end people. I feel like you really do need to know a little bit about the underpinnings, and I don't know how easy it is to go and say, is there a presenter for this like object that I'm working with? Like, I don't know, but it's definitely something, maybe that's something I can take with me if I get MRs that have front end and back end to look at that. That's like the interaction level that I can look at in the front end code and be like, okay, how are they pulling the data from the back end in? Because when it comes to the Vue stuff, I was like reading, I mean, I don't know, it feels like it's reading like some mix of XML and like French or something, like two languages. Like, I don't know. It's really hard for me to read.
It is like French.
Not at all.
No, it just feels like it's like two languages that it's like, I kind of understand what's happening, but I don't know enough to be able to review it and say, this is a bad practice, or this could be improved, or I think you showed some MRs previously where you were like, oh, the way this view object or this method is being called, it's actually not correct. Like, I just don't have the domain knowledge.
Yeah,
to
and
know
that
about
I
whether
think that that's okay. Like, and so like from a front end perspective, this is a great. I'm gonna try to abstract from this as this affects code review in general.
Yeah.
I am going to be concerned from the front end perspective. I am concerned about, I do need to be concerned about the data I get in. I want to make sure it's correct. The implementation details, I'm not going to be able to be, I'm not going to be concerned about. It's that interface. Like, did I actually get an authenticated value for this? And that interface, I'm really, really concerned about, and that's going to trickle a little bit into how we get to that interface. But the implementation details, that is a little bit of a black box from the front end perspective. And it's going to be a waste of my time to other front enders' time to feel like they have to know everything. So from the database perspective, I'd say it's similar. It's like, I'm concerned about the interface. Are there any like large issues jumping out, like big performance issues of like, well, this just isn't going to work. We need to do something totally different. Or, you know, from the database perspective, the interface requirements are pretty much, is it normalized? And if it's not normalized, there's got to be a freaking good reason. And that's my understanding of good rule of thumb for database interface. And sometimes there is.
It
Sometimes,
depends. Like going all the way down to the fourth normal form or whatever usually is not worth.
that's true. Usually it's not the most performant. So it's like, I don't know.
Quick thought before before it goes away. Because you just mentioned the HAML interfaces once more, and what I just said about the missing documentation between the interface of the backend and the view application, thinking about it, in the front end, in 99% of the cases, we don't actually test for it. Like, it is super common to build a view application, which is requiring some inputs, and then basically in our tests mock those inputs, and after those tests are done, we basically be like, okay, with all the inputs we were expecting, this is actually doing good, all good. So our front-end tests are more or less completely independent from what the backend is doing. And we would have all the flexibility or the room for error in the backend. Like, we could leak anything into the DOM. Front-end tests, and yeah, we would not find it there. I don't know about the backend test suite, but that is something I'm kind of fearful of.
And this is a great point. And I feel like
and that's why they changed recently to have backend reviewers required to review HAML changes. It used to be just front end, and now it is backend as well.
Which sounds like a good idea.
I think the thing to abstract there is that we all need to take ownership of the whole feature and make sure things get appropriately reviewed. And if I feel like I have no idea what Ruby is, I should excuse myself from reviewing the HAML, because I can't just assume model dot, I can just expose model dot access token or whatever. I need, and so things can get things. I think it is worth all reviewers to not get so focused on their expertise. Like, and we do have to all be aware of the full stack and the whole feature that's going on. But it's a challenge. I don't know.
And the sanitization, for example, can be pretty tricky. Like, there was one recently that I was involved in, and I was like, well, the doc said don't use HTML safe. I thought that meant not everywhere, not anywhere. And they're like, well, it's okay. And actually this value has been previously, even though it's originally user input, it's been, made safe prior to this point. So it's okay. You don't have to make it safe in the view, but there's a lot of subtlety, and you have to know, like, deeper in the stack, especially around security and sanitization of HAML. What's going on?
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that's a takeaway as, yeah, we all have our expertises. That's not a word. Our expertise, I'm pretty sure it's expertias. But it is all our responsibility to be aware of what's going on. And a lot will fall through the cracks if we just focus on our own domains. You know, if we just focus on, and that's, I'm not sure how we can officially support this other than trying to just really create a culture of short toes and a culture that almost has inverted toes that encourages the stepping on. Yeah, inverted toes that encourages stepping on them. Yeah,
That's so gross. And I think that was what it was, at least at the crux of my discussion around the maintainership and some of the lack of psychological safety, you know, for required maintainership. Because like I said, I don't think I've ever written a migration at GitLab. And, you know, there's tons of things I haven't seen. And even though I've done a lot of view and a lot of front end, like there's so many subtle things there that I just don't have internalized. And so I feel like I'm just not competent to be a last line reviewer on the front end or the back end, to be honest. Just because of the experience I've had and with the technologies and with the GitLab code base is not necessarily traditional.
yeah. Well,
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, yeah, 100%. I don't know who needs to hear this, or maybe it's just for the recording, but I highly agree with what Chad just said. Like, our code base is way too big to know every corner or to know all the challenges about it. From my personal experiences, I walk away from reviews quite a bit because I just don't know, and I've personally never had any bad experience from it. Bonus points, and whenever I find the time I do this, I try to still follow it. And if it's not completely off the hooks, I kind of look at the solution and see what's up and try to learn from it. That really depends on how big and how complex this thing was. But this is absolutely highly encouraged, in my opinion.
Yeah. Can I drop some thoughts to you all on pertaining to this? I feel like no reviewer needs to know everything. And I almost feel like no reviewer really needs to know anything except this one thing, which is how to ask good questions. And everyone's at different level there. The only difference then between a reviewer and a maintainer from that perspective is maintainers are really good at asking the right questions, and they can they do it efficiently because they've, you know, put in the X hundreds of hours in the code base. And so going back to this specifically, man, database reviews. This is a technology I definitely don't feel comfortable with. But yeah, the code base is so large, but there's common quality attributes we can ask at every level. Are there security issues here? I don't see any security issues here. That's might not be an issue, but maybe if I'm really worried about it. It's performance issues here. Like, and okay, have we hurt performance? What was the previous performance? Can I get any kind of, can I ask this? If I don't see here, there's lots of interesting data on it. It looks like, well, looks good. A database expert has approved this. Like, so I have more confidence feeling good about it. But I think just asking the right questions is that's the role. You don't have to be the database expert, but getting more comfortable asking questions. And sometimes that means asking dumb, I know they say there's no dumb questions, but sometimes you ask a question, you feel dumb for asking. So sometimes that means doing trial and error with your questions, and that's okay. Like, we got to have a culture where that's really fine to hold up an MR because someone has questions. Let's help our culture in that way. I don't know, what do you all think of that?
I really did try to take something from our meeting last week about asking questions, and I practiced it, and it was a good. I felt like it was nice. I asked a question in an MR, and the person linked me back to kind of something that helped me get more context in what I was reviewing, which was really awesome. I was like, oh, it does work.
That's good. That's a good
So
feeling.
thank you. I'm trying to link it into the document because I thought it was
That's good. That's good.
it was just a small question that I asked when I was yesterday.
That's something you should have shared on the show and tell.
I just added it. I
did.
just thought of it now. I like literally, sorry. Yeah, I was woken up at 4 o'clock this morning by a baby. So,
You're good.
but I'm sharing it now and it'll be on the recording. So yeah, I
Oh.
think, and you almost feel silly. Sometimes I'll feel silly, like about asking questions, and I do that. I'm like, oh man, this is like, but in person, I never feel dumb asking questions. I literally don't care. I don't know why I feel differently sometimes asynchronously, because in person, I don't know. I don't really care what people think most of the time when I'm in groups.
Yeah.
Online, it just seems different and more permanent.
What I sometimes do about stupid questions, take this with a grain of salt. I don't know if this is a good practice because it's a little fear driven, but when I encounter something in an MR, I just imagine myself like, okay, this might be a stupid question to ask, but if there's actually an issue here that I am now too shy to ask, and this thing gets merged, or I'll be merging this, and this thing explodes, then I'll be the one who just did not ask the stupid question, and that feel even worse. So therefore, let's get it ahead from now. It might be stupid. Okay, I can live with that. But having a stupid one merge, that feels even worse. So that's how I approach it.
So that when it all goes down, Yana can say, well, I asked a question about it.
Yeah, and that'll be something.
I'm
No,
joking.
there's a lot to be said for CYA driven development. It's like, hey, I asked.
That's funny. That's funny.
Stupid question on this side. What's CIA for? Like the institution CIA. Okay, gotcha.
Oh,
No.
But that's
See,
related to it, I think.
cover your assets.
Yeah, cover your assets. Yeah. That's
Gotcha.
good.
The other side of that though is like I've spent a lot of time like down in one of those corners, like the GitLab flavor markdown specification and testing and like harness around that and snapshot testing. And there's not another reviewer on the back end team currently, it's just me. So it's a bit tedious, like when I've had to just pick a random roulette reviewer and they're like, what is this? Like, and they ask this some of the same questions over and over, and I carefully and attentively explain the same thing that I've explained maybe 2 or 3 times before. So I tried a different approach recently. I just asked in the Markdown channel for like the half dozen people that have reviewed these before, like, does anyone want to volunteer to review these 3 that I've got queued up since you've at least seen this code before?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's not Rails, it's like not even related to Rails. It's just like greenfield algorithms and YAML files. So people look at it, they're like, what is this?
Would it be, and I'm just saying, like, thinking of this as someone coming in, would it be worthwhile to put some, like a quick developer's guide together for the area that you're?
Oh, I've got one that's about 20 pages. It's like almost too big, and I linked it in every EMR. It explains everything, and I try to link out to the relevant sections in the documentation of the file. But then it's like, well, that's almost too much. That makes me even more confused.
The
I could feel like
keyword that ask was quick developer guide.
Yeah.
It's split up. There's parts of it I can link to about the parts, and I try to do that.
Yeah, because I try to think about it the same way. For what we work on with Elasticsearch, I often worry that people don't have enough context to give it like a thorough review.
Yeah, so I have an approach for this. Like if I'm authoring an MR that I realize this is a little different than the average thing you'll run into the code base, and it's been going on without you for a while, So we're, how do we get brand newcomers to review this? I will leave a lot of annotations. I'm almost anticipating if a community contributor reviewed this, they'd be able to, every line of code would have, and every function, this is why. If something's really large, if I can't do that because I'm making a really large change, I gotta loop in someone that has context. But I do like to know, like, okay, I realize this is something that's very context specific, but it's small. In those cases, I love looping in people outside of the domain and giving them, some sort of exposure, increasing the exposure to the domain heavy code.
Yeah, and that's something I've really tried to be intentional about on these. Like, do a self-review first, and at least like the questions that I've had before, pre-answer them. Or like, this is split up, like I had to split up the MR somehow. I'm trying to be nice to the reviewers, but this isn't even used yet. But it's going to be used in this MR over here.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm putting it in now, just to split it up somehow.
Yeah. So I have a question to you all. I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because I don't think this is adding any. We've diverged from the screen. The question to you all being, I guess there's two questions. One is, have you ever run into an MR and you're like, I don't even know what's going on or how to start this review. This is really challenging. And when that's the case, you can either, I usually do this, double down. I am going to understand what's going on here. And I spend probably way too much time doing it. Or do you think it's healthy to just say, I'm having a really hard time understanding this. I think there's context I'm not aware of. Could you, the contributor, leave some comments explaining blocks of code and why they're there?
That's a great suggestion, because often you're a brilliant engineer, Paul. You're almost always capable of the former. Sometimes I'm not. I'm like, there's no way I'm figuring this out. It's literally impossible for me unless somebody sits down and explains it to me.
Well, I still haven't figured out your markdown script. So I'm joking. I'm giving you a hard time, Chad. I'll give you a hard time, Chad. I'm sorry. It's because I haven't read the documentation.
They're functional.
I think what Paul just suggested is a great idea. What I encounter from time to time, kind of even worse, where it is not so much about the coach. Like, let's imagine an MR coming in within my field of expertise, the front end, looking through the changes, kind of makes sense. Like, I would need to see this running, but okay, cool. And now the final boss, it's gonna be in Geo. Or like, there is something, we just do have features available that are so ridiculously hard to reproduce, that are just way out of this. These are super tough. I like Paul's idea. What I usually do, or sometimes do, when I'm not just getting away from it, I ask for a sync session. Especially when it is about reproduction. Like, how can we make this the most efficient? Like, I basically need to see the car running. Help me out. Let's pair up on this. That is what I did in such cases.
Yeah.
Time. Which is last sentence on this, which might not be ideal. Maybe we should start recording this or take it async somewhere, because the second reviewer, they'll probably just lose the information, which is not great. So finding a way to preserve this is something to work on.
Yeah. I have another question for you all. I didn't want to interrupt. Someone else had something to say though. The other question is, it's interesting how some of these reviews do require some parts of the code base, some MRs require just a level of expertise that is, or familiarity with something that's happened before. And to me, that's like a code smell. I feel like, how come this isn't intuitive? Like, what can we do to make it more intuitive? But I also, despite all my optimism, I'm a little bit of a realist, where I realize there's some parts you just gonna have to explain. And I would like to hear from you all, what's the litmus test for you all of knowing, okay, this just requires some expertise and training. This is unintuitive. And we're creating complexities that maybe we should avoid because we've now created a silo where no one can understand it except the people involved in building it.
Very quick litmus test would maybe be, is it in the docs? Kinda, because the stuff we're speaking about, it is complex and we can't start from scratch all every single time. But things in the docs still complex, but easy to reproduce and document it, obviously, rather than this is our product, you know how it works. Could you please do a review? That's, well, maybe I could, but what about the next person? So that's kind of what I'm aiming for.
I like that question. I don't know if I have a great answer. I like to look at how easy, I mean, I don't know. I feel like if something is easy to test, then it's generally okay-ish. I say that very humbly because the code area that I work in, I feel like is very difficult to test. But I think I have gotten like most of my team on board with looking at like a pretty large refactor, at least starting to discuss what like a new architecture for the code would look like. Because I'm like really dreading new people joining the team. And I feel like it inhibits it, like, I mean, if your team's not seeing community contributors, maybe that's a smell because they
Really?
can't come up to speed. And it really shouldn't be a barrier to like, that's a barrier to contributing.
That's a fantastic point.
Yeah.
That would be go ahead.
Yannick.
That would be a mean OKR for a team to actually try to track those and get the issues polished up to be able to be picked up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it does take effort to get issues to the point where people can pick them up. But also I feel like, especially in the Elasticsearch space, just some of the way that the code is architected or just the way the code is laid out, like it's hard to test. And also as when I have to dig into it, I'm like, ooh, I have to remember how this works.
That's a good point. What were we gonna say, Chad?
I was gonna say that's a really good point, Terry. And that's what I was thinking. Like the coupling and cohesion, right? It should be ideally small cohesive modules that are loosely coupled, and the tests, tests serve many purposes, not just for regression testing and not just to drive your architecture, but they also serve as a form of documentation. And you should be able to look at the tests and say, okay, here's my external interface, here's the assertions that I'm making about that, and get some insight into it. It's hard to write that sort of a test. Having said that, the markdown specification stuff I've been working on, like itself is a snapshot characterization golden master type framework, and I'm writing those types of tests to do it. So I would say the tests are like, there's not a lot to them, but they cover everything thoroughly, but they're not that easy to understand. So I honestly don't think I've achieved that very well there, but our user facing code. So maybe the dial's down a little bit.
Yeah, I think in your case, that domain, Chad, is like you're dealing at like a couple of notches higher level of abstraction than most. We're already in software land, but it's like
it's not like a controller and a view.
Yeah, I know something about it is like it does make sense, but it is unfamiliar. It's like very unfamiliar territory than most people are that review the GitLab code base are doing, because we don't usually do that kind of automated or intentional with that kind of the main goal there, which even that goal has a level of unfamiliarity, which that's interesting.
And I keep trying to talk myself down. It's like, is this even needed? Is it design right? Is it overcomplicated? And I talked to like Enrique on the content editor. He's like, no, this is going to be really useful. keep doing what you're doing. I'm like,
Yeah,
okay.
because what you're doing is going to add so much confidence to making changes. That's what's tough, is it's like layers removed from the main thing we plan on changing. But what you're doing is going to add so much confidence to that. That's a big point. And that's going back to what Terry said is, man, tests mean so much. It's so easy just to ignore them. But they really do mean so much to the actual stability and longevity and fun that it is to work on a project. It's a good point. And I think it's critical to community contributions is tests. They don't want to run the whole app. They probably just want to run the tests, and they should be able to.
Yeah, maybe that's another good topic for, I mean, we're near the end of the time here, but maybe that's a good topic for this. Is like, what do people look at when they're reviewing tests? Hopefully everyone's reviewing tests. But I mean, I try my best to kind of review things and making sure that, I mean, I don't always say like, is this thing testing everything it should be testing? Like, I do rely a lot on that little widget that colors the little side of the line. Has this been hit? I really love that thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I think about. I do like to look at the specs that are written.
Yeah, you brought up something that got me. You brought up such a passionate subject for me. I'm gonna have to, and it just came up a couple of times, so I was like, oh, I got to do
So
this.
it's real relevant and
Yes.
like actively happening.
And we might, maybe it's worth. There's not a merged by. Maybe it's worth closing on this too, because we're reaching time.
Like while you're finding that my answer to your question, Terry, is I look if they're fast. Like, and we have some unique things like the let it be's and let it be and all of that.
Oh yeah.
Like every little bit hurts. Like if you ran all of our tests end to end on the back end, it would probably take a month if they weren't running.
Yeah. I remember when I first got here, I just tried to run RSpec because I didn't quite understand like the breadth of what that did. And I was just like talking to my husband. I was like, the tests have been running for a long time and they're not finishing. It's really weird.
Oh yeah.
Because I used to working at places where there weren't that many, like I would come in and there would be no tests or like very little. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to get to work on this thing. I'm going to add some tests here. And they would still run pretty fast.
And not to hijack, but like what I've done on the stuff I'm working on, since it's outside of Rails, I've intentionally taken that opportunity to make it a little bit more complex. The Rails stuff is like in this little sub process, but all of the other stuff is with fast test spec. And most of my TDD of the actual algorithm runs in like 0.2 seconds, 200 milliseconds. Yeah. So that's really nice. It's fast, but at a little bit of extra complexity cost.
Yeah.
And it seems like our code coverage doesn't always detect when you cover it in a sub process, which is a whole other problem I'm just now realizing.
It should. It really should, because of those artifacts that get built from the spec thing, but maybe not. I don't know.
Maybe I have to look at, that's my task today. Anyway, go ahead, Paul.
No, I want to share this MR is removing lines of production scripts. It's just removing lots of lines of production scripts and changing GraphQL files. And so when I looked at this and I saw, okay, well, we're removing the relevant part in our other spec, but there weren't any test updates to this. And I was like, okay, is this a pure, so then the question is this a pure refactor? Meaning that if there's a pure refactor, then if changing something like this, you wouldn't expect to change any tests because these are all just implementation details. And that's actually kind of the goal, is to make this a pure refactor. But I did my favorite thing, which is I don't know. So I'm going to just add a bug where I comment out, these blocks in our GraphQL, and do any of the tests fail? And sure enough, none of our unit tests and none of our feature specs failed. And just for simplicity's sake, I was like, okay, well, we don't have any feature specs covering like this time log feature up to this specific bit of like deleting a time log. So let's cover this at the feature level, and then maybe we can figure out how to push it down down the pyramid. But this was really I was close to merging this, but I did block it because I was like, okay, we're making this refactoring, but I want to be really safe with it, so we should probably add tests to it.
Our pyramid was like just kind of missing some bricks at the top, like that.
Exactly. Like the real,
Cheops, is that the one that's sort of weird shaped at the top?
yeah, exactly. This one was also interesting. This was a talking about being optimistic about issues. So this is refactoring a feature spec to run under the context of a subgroup and a regular group, that requirement came from this issue that I created, pre-COVID. I was like, oh man, this is an old issue. Things were so much simpler then. And it came from, there was an S1 bug that had an MR change. This was the bug fix. But we didn't have any tests updating this, but because it was so high priority that we fixed this right away, I was like, okay, I confirmed this works. Let's just create a follow-up to add test coverage so that we don't run into this again. So 2 years later, it gets picked up to add test coverage, which is great. But what I realized was like, okay, so if we added the test coverage, me reverting this 2-year-old bug fix would have caused a test failure. So I left that comment here because I was like, we are improving the tests already so much. So this is good, but I'm going to leave a non-blocking comment of, hey, I tried to revert the fix that was the cause of us identifying some test coverage, but everything passed. So I was like, maybe there's some more coverage we need to write. I thought we just needed to do this. I don't see anything as actually doing this. And Flory, on observation, she was like, we're not even ever calling that function anymore. So we have, so all of this of like identifying test coverage, identified, wow, we actually probably have large gaps because it's all Vuex actions. And we've done this huge GraphQL migration stuff. Is like, we actually probably have a large bit that we could remove here that isn't even being called ever. So it was cool. I just wanted to bring up too, like, yeah, tests are so central to so much of code cleanliness that it's worth, treating them as a, top priority in reviews. Yeah, those are my stories. Thanks for letting me share my stories.
That was great discussion. I know we're at the end of time, so I will leave the database link for next time if we do want to review it and maybe try to prep more if I see a more interesting one. I picked the one I picked because it's also GraphQL, which is somewhat of a struggle for me. I will not be here next week though, so if we want to push it out another week, that's fine.
Yeah, that sounds great. If I can drop some thoughts for you to be mulling over your head about it, I would love to see what questions were asked in a database review and how that changed, because I think we can abstract from there. It's so easy when you're not certain about something to feel like, well, someone worked on it and it works, I can't touch it. But I'd love to see like, hey, we did this, but we actually had to really change it. And what was the catalyst to needing to change it? And those so much.
I'm gonna have to look for an MR that was reviewed by someone else then.
Well, I don't know.
But there are some really incredible MR database reviewers that when this person's like usually there's a few people when I know that they're gonna get the review after me, I'm like, okay, I do what Yannick, you said you do, I follow it because I'm like, okay, I will learn something here.
Yeah.
And I usually do. So I'll try to see if I can find one and maybe leave it for 2 weeks out.
Oh, cool. Appreciate it, Terry.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks everyone for hopping on. Adios.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye. Have a good weekend.